Hello, magandang araw sa inyong lahat. Ako si Arion Sanchez, isa sa mga guro ng Media and Information Literacy. At ako ang inatasang mag-discuss sa inyo o mag-lecture sa unang lesson ng subject natin, which is Introduction to Media and Information Literacy. Bago ang lahat, gusto ko lang ipaalam na from time to time, I will be switching between English and Filipino para mas madaling madiscuss at maintindihan ng ating mga lessons. Gusto ko rin sabihin na susubukan natin gawing casual ang pagtalakay at iwasan ang pagiging masyadong formal ng lecture series na ito para kahit papaano ma-replicate kung paano natin ito tatalakayin sa silid-aralan. Daanan lang natin yung mga paksa o topics na tatalakayin natin para sa unang linggo para klaro sa atin ang organization at flow ng mga pag-uusapan natin. So una, pag-uusapan natin ang communication. Ano ba ito? At ang dalawang basic types of communication. Ang malaking parte ng sesyon ay ilalaan natin para sa mga communication models. Meron tayong 8 na tatalakayin, namely ang Laswell Communication Model, ang Shannon-Weaver Communication Model, ang Westley-Maclean Communication Model, ang Gerbner Communication Model, ang Publicity Model, ang Reception Model, na merong 2 tayong tatalakayin, which is kay Stuart Hall and yung kay Osgood-Schramm, at magtatapos tayo kay Berlo or sa communication model ni Berlo. Pagkatapos nun, dadaanan natin ang 10 levels of intimacy. Pagkatapos ay pag-uusapan natin ang media literacy, information literacy, at ang digital or technology literacy. I-define natin sila. Titingnan natin kung meron silang mga pagkakaiba o pagkakapareho sa isa't isa. At magtatapos tayo sa kung paano naapektuhan ng media and information ang communication. So kung klaro na't lahat, magsimula na tayo. So unang-una sa lahat, kailangan muna natin pag-usapan ang communication. Importanteng alamin natin ano ba ang communication, bakit tayo nagko-communicate, at kung ano yung mga proseso o paraan kung paano tayo nagko-communicate. So i-define natin ang communication as the act or process of using words, sounds, signs, or behaviors to express or exchange information or to express ideas, thoughts, or feelings to someone else. And ideally, this would result in understanding. Mamaya, makikita natin na kaya ako sinabing ideally kasi hindi palaging nagkakaroon ng understanding between yung nagbibigay ng message at yung tumatanggap ng message. So, very important detail yun. So, sa ating definition, may kita natin na meron tayong isang message, first and foremost, na gustong iparating. May sender o merong source ng message at merong magko-consume or may audience or merong tatanggap ng message na yon. Ngayon, meron tayong 2 types ng communication. Simply, they are non-verbal and verbal. Pag sinabi mong non-verbal, ito yung mga paraan ng pag-communicate or pagbigay ng message na hindi gumagamit ng text or hindi nagsasalita para maparating ito. So, maraming mga examples ang pwede nating ibigay under non-verbal, one of which are signs, symbols, colors kapag images ang pinapakita mo, or for example, sa pananamit, pwede rin gumamit ng color. Body language, very important in you picking up social cues sa isang tao or sa isang group. Facial expressions, madalas tinitingnan din natin ito para makakuha ng impormasyon or para makuha ang message na binibigay sa atin, whether intentional or hindi. So, madalas magagamit natin itong mga aspetong ito para mabuo yung message na gustong iparating sa atin. Sa verbal naman, mainly meron lang oral and written. Next, we're going to talk about the different communication models or transmission models that we can use to examine or evaluate different types of media. The first one would be Laswell's communication model in 1948, and it's also known as the action model, the linear model, or the one-way model of communication. And it has 5 main components. It starts with the communicator, with the message, which is the second component, through the medium to the receiver with the desired effect. So yun yung 5 components. There are also different types of analysis for each component. In analyzing the communicator, we call it the control analysis. In analyzing the message, we call it content analysis. In analyzing the medium, just media analysis. If we analyze the receiver, then it's the audience analysis. And lastly would be effect analysis. So control analysis helps the sender have the power or the ability to send the desired message. For content analysis, dito pumapasok yung pagtingin sa purpose or ulterior motives nung message. Bakit ba sinend tong message na to? The media analysis, it represents which medium is most effective. Dapat bang gamitin natin ang text to send the message or mas okay ba na sabihin na lang, etc. etc. For audience analysis, we look at the target audience that the message is sent to. And then lastly, the effect analysis, it's actually done before the process starts. So, meron tayong desired effect na gusto, and then based on that, iniiba natin yung message or through which channel na gagamitin natin. Okay? Minsan pinapalitan na natin yung communicator if mas effective yung isa pang person na magsasabi, etc. etc. O halimbawa, inutusan ka ng nanay mo na bumili ng suka sa kanto. So obviously, if we use the model, the communicator would be your mom. The message would be the order, which is to buy vinegar. The medium would be speaking or oral communication. And then the receiver would be yourself. And there are different types of effects. Pwedeng, ang effect is bumili ka ng suka. Pwede rin na nagdabog ka, tapos pinagalitan ka ng nanay mo. Pwede rin yun yung effect. So, very easy to use yung communication model ni Laswell. Ngayon, meron din naman mga criticism dun sa model niya. Since isa siya sa mga unang lumabas na model of communication, wala pa rito yung, number 1, yung feedback. Kasi alam naman natin sa communication, hindi lang naman one way ang pag-transfer ng message. Posibleng may sabihin ka rin sa nanay mo, sa example natin, and wala to sa model ni Laswell. It also ignores the possibility of noise, which is just disruptions or things that can affect the sending of the message from communicator to receiver. For example, kung maingay at hindi mo narinig yung utos ng nanay mo, that would be noise, which Laswell doesn't account for sa model niya. Sa model niya, dire-diretso lang yung message. So, absolutely assumed na nakukuha kung ano man yung message nung sender, anong communicator or yung sender to the receiver. And lastly, it's very simplistic. Alam naman natin sa communication, very complex. Maraming factors that play in and hindi lang one way. So, yun yung naging mga criticism sa model niya. So next we have the Shannon-Weaver communication model, which was also made in 1948. Shannon was an American mathematician and electrical engineer, while Weaver was an American scientist. And ginamit nila ito para ma-improve yung technical communication before. But it can also be used, and it was also used in the field of communication, kasi applicable din pala siya. So medyo different siya sa Laswell model, wherein we still have the communicator or the sender, but now we have new terms such as the encoder and the decoder. The encoder, which converts the message into signals such as waves or binary data and sends it through a channel, which is the medium. okay, into the decoder, which converts the signals back into the message that the receiver can understand. They also account for feedback, wherein the receiver can send a message back to the original sender. So, ang criticisms naman dito sa model ni Shannon and ni Weaver was that it was also a bit general or simplistic, and then it was more effective or applicable in interpersonal communication, meaning one-to-one, person A to person B. Yun lang siya. It doesn't really reflect yung mga mass communications or group communication. It's also just based on a sender/receiver relationship wherein the sender has a primary role. So, examples, kunyari, talking. If we use this model, the brain would be the sender, and then the encoder would be the mouth that can convert the brain signals into actual words. The air would be the channel wherein the words or the message will travel into the ear of the person, which is the decoder, and then back to the brain, which is the receiver. For example, kung nag-uusap sa phone, iba naman to. The man can take the place of the sender, and then yung phone or yung gadget niya would be the encoder, and then it will convert the message into wave signals through the cable or the network or the phone company to the other phone, which will be then decoded into sound waves that can be understood by the other person. Another example, kunwari nagpa-personal message ka sa FB. The person making the message would be the sender. The keyboard or the computer would be the encoder to convert yung words na gusto mo into binary data. And then Facebook or the internet would be the channel, while the screen or the computer of the other person would be the decoder para makita niya yung message. And then the person would be the receiver. So we have different levels of communication problems which they account for, right? The first one would be technical problems, okay? Or how a channel causes problems. Kapag faulty yung signal or may sira pala yung wire or something, then that can cause technical problems. Number two is semantic problem, meaning the meaning of the message sent is different from the meaning of the message received. So, iba yung nakuha ko dun sa sinabi mo. And then number three would be the effectiveness problem or how it causes a certain reaction. Posible na yung intention ko ay hindi pala yun yung magiging effect sa'yo. For example, gusto kitang i-convince na bumili ng product. Pero dahil ganito ka palang tao, very thrifty ka or gusto mong nagsasave, yung message ko hindi ka niya na-convince. So, it becomes an effectiveness problem. You get my message, loud and clear, pero hindi siya ume-effect sa'yo. Kapag iba yung message na nakukuha mo dun sa message na sinasabi ko, that would be semantic problem. Yun. So, hopefully, clear naman yon. The third communication model would be Westley and Maclean's communication model in 1957. And dito medyo naguguluhan yung mga students na nagte-take up nito kasi medyo complex yung itsura niya. But let's start with the terms first so we can identify yung different components ng model. And let's use an example para meron tayong pinagbabasihan muna. Let's take a look at printing a newspaper article or printing a newspaper. Okay? So the X sub 1, X sub 2, X sub 3, etc., to X sub n, these would be your sensory experiences, objects of orientation, messages, okay? These are events or information na nakukuha ng A. Ngayon, ano yung A? This would be the advocate. Sa example natin, sila yung authors or original writers ng mga articles na ipapublish sa newspaper. Next, we have C, which is the channel. It can also be the gatekeeper. And in our example, sila yung editors. Okay? So, dadaan sa kanila muna yung articles na isusulat ni A. And yung mga articles na yun yung X na may superscript na 1. These are the messages na isa-send ni A to C. Same thing goes with C to B. The X na may superscript na 2, yun yung magiging articles na i-consume ngayon ni B or ng readers natin. I just like to note that yung mga events or information does not necessarily have to pass through A to reach C. Okay? Minsan, editors can verify information themselves. They also have different events or news sources. So, meron tayong yung X3 and X4, posibleng mag-jump na siya straight to C. So, that's totally possible. Ngayon, yung F na nakikita natin would be the feedback. The F sub BA would be the feedback from reader to the writers. F sub BC would be from the readers to the editors, and F sub CA would be from the editors to the original authors. This model can be used in interpersonal and mass communication. So, kung sa mass communication, ang difference lang would be the rate of feedback. It would of course be slower. Kapag interpersonal, mas mabilis ang feedback kasi pwedeng mag-react kagad yung audience natin. But in our newspaper example, siguro ilang days bago makuha ulit ni author or ni editor yung feedback ni reader. For example, mali pala yung na-publish na details. And then, saka palang magkakaroon ng errata dun sa newspaper na nagkamali kami sa pag-post, sa pagsulat, and we apologize for this, etc., etc. So, that could take longer. So, yun yung one of the few advantages nitong model na to. It can be applied to interpersonal and mass communication. There's a large emphasis on the concept of feedback, and factors are included in the objects of orientation or yung mga events natin. The disadvantages, though, would be that it's a bit too complicated to understand, and it also does not account for noise. So, for example, mali yung pagprint or malabo pala yung pagprint dun sa newspaper. E di hindi makukuha ng audience or ng readers yung message na or yung articles na pinublish dun sa newspaper. Or for example, hindi pala nakuha ng maayos ni editor yung message ng article, na corrupt kunyari yung file. So, iba na yung X na may superscript na 1, hindi na makakarating kay editor ng tama. So, it does not account for noise, which is totally possible. Yung pang-apat na communication model natin would be Gerbner's version in 1956. And it stresses the dynamic nature of communication and its reliability. Tingnan muna natin yung mga components ng model. First, let's look at E. E would be the event. Much like yung X sub 1, X sub 2 natin sa Westley and Maclean's communication model. Ngayon, this E, this event, goes through selection, it goes through context, and it goes through the availability of the person. M would be the man or the machine which gets the message, okay? And E1 would be the perceived message by M. Perceived message meaning, kung ano man yung event na may information, hindi eksaktong nakukuha ni M yung information na yon. It could be because limited lang tayo in terms of yung pag-process natin ng information. Posible rin na may hinahanap lang tayong information. Okay? So, it goes through selection, may tatawag na context and availability. All of this happens in the perceptual dimension. So, itong E to M na pathway would be the relationship between the communicating agent, which is M, and the world of event, which is E. Selection basically means na limited yung point of view natin. Limited yung how much info yung pwede nating makuha. 'Di ba kapag binigyan tayo ng image and then sobrang daming objects yung nandun, hindi naman natin ma-retain lahat ng information na nandun. So if given an event, which is showing you a picture of an image, ang makukuha mong E1, which is your perceived message, would be distorted already by selection kung ano yung pinili mong ma-retain na information, whether consciously or subconsciously. The context now would be the circumstances which allow you to perceive kung ano man yung event na yon. And then the availability would be factors of M, the man or the machine, that affect perception. Posibleng sa mood mo, posibleng sa personality mo at that given time. Kung inaantok ka pala and then hindi mo pala napansin or hindi mo nakuha lahat ng sinasabi ng environment or ng isa pang tao, then selected na kagad yung information na kukuha mo. Yung availability ng pag-retain ng information, compromised na. The second part of the model would be between the man or the machine or the communicating agent to the communication product. Wala pa to dun sa isa pang person na pagbibigyan ng message. It's just to the product or the message itself. So just like E1, we have E2. But now, it goes through channels. It uses a particular form of medium, right? And yung S mo, yun yung form mo or signal. Depende sa type ng output mo kung ano yung magiging S mo. For example, may nakita kang na-inspire ka sa nature, which is E. Nakuha mong E1 because of your context would be ang ganda pala ng mundo or napaka-pangit pala ng mundo, okay? And then you decide to write a poem about it. Yung channel mo or yung medium mo could be paper, could be oral communication kung gusto mong sabihin sa isang tao, and yung signal mo or yung form mo would be either text, either spoken word, and the E2 would be your message. Ngayon, kung posibleng maiba yung E2 sa E1, depende kung paano siya mako-convert from yung perceived message mo to yung product mo. So, basically, dun sa model ni Gerbner, it's just world to person to actual message or to the product. It does not include the receiver of the message, but you can compound that to this model. Ngayon, yung E2 na yan, yun yung magsaserve as the E of a new M. So, try nyong mag-drawing ng model for two people using Gerbner's model of communication, kung ano ang magiging itsura niya dapat. It's important to note that messages at every level is altered or changed. At yun yung pinapahalagahan ni Gerbner. Na objectively, you cannot take the information from E and convert it 100%. Maapektuhan na yon nung mga factors that make you up. Yung kakayahan mong magsalita, yung kakayahan mong mag-form ng sentences. So, just the same as our selection, our context, and availability changes the E to an E1, so does the channel or the media changes your E1 to your E2 kapag finished product na siya. For our publicity model, gaya ng sinabi sa PowerPoint, it's a communication as display and attention. So dito, audiences are more of spectators rather than participants. So they're one way in nature. Yung sign na yon, kung ano lang yung makuha mo, yun na yon. Kung ano yung message na yon, yun na yon. There is absolutely no room for feedback when it comes to the publicity model. So examples of these are advertisements, billboards, logos. It is possible to send feedback to a type of advertisement. However, based sa publicity model, hindi na niya tinatake account yung feedback. If it reaches you, if the message reaches you, then that's it. So yun ang pinaka-objective niya. Does it reach the target audience effectively. So, yun. Under the reception model, we'll be looking at Stuart Hall's communication model of 1973 and Osgood and Schramm's communication model of 1954. Firstly, yung kay Hall, what's important to note is that Hall gives emphasis on the translation of a message. It starts with the frameworks of knowledge, the relations of production, and technical infrastructure. From there, ginagawa yung message. It is being encoded, okay, with the meanings and yung structures which are present. And then, dinadialogue siya, dinidiscourse siya sa intended audience. It will then be decoded, and then, depending on the person which is doing the decoding, it can have different meanings because of their different frameworks of knowledge, their different relations of production, and their different technical infrastructure. So, yun lang naman siya, basically. Dito pumapasok yung nag-iiba yung meaning. Even if the discourse is objective, nag-iiba yung meaning dahil iba yung frameworks natin, iba yung beliefs natin, iba yung culture in understanding different events. So even if we get the same message, the meaning of a particular message can be different and can vary from person to person. That's why it's called the perception model, how you perceive something. So it has certain similarities dun sa model ni Gerbner, in which selection, context, and availability also take a part in perceiving the message, right? Okay, now we move on to Osgood and Schramm's communication model in 1954. And I'd like to point out that this also falls under the reception model. It's just different from Stuart Hall's version in that instead of being linear, it showcases a loop, right, from person to person. Kung titingnan nyo yung model nila, the decoder and the encoder would be the same person. If we start with a message, okay, i-decode muna siya ng person na yon, i-interpret yung data, and then kapag mag-respond siya, mag-encode naman siya ng panibagong message to be decoded and interpreted by the other person. So yun lang naman siya. What this model showcases is that equal and reciprocal ang both parties. It is very interpersonal such that kung more than two people, medyo hindi na nag-work yung model natin. Here, redundancy is important and feedback is central. So we talked about semantic noise before, and in this model, semantic noise is ideally reduced because na-verify and nako-confirm nung person kung tama ba yung sinabi mo, ito ba yung sinasabi mo, and may chance na mag-respond si other person. Ngayon, ang disadvantage lang dito, aside from it's only for interpersonal communication, is that it assumes that the two parties are equal in communication. It's possible na mas dominant ang isang nagpa-participate rather than the other one. Either he or she has a higher position of power or influence, or mas fluent sila sa pagsalita. So, discourse becomes unequal. But here, in this model, it shows na pantay lang pareho, which is not the case always. Lastly, we have Berlo's SMCR communication model in 1960. So, kung hindi nyo pa na-figure out kung ano ibig sabihin ng SMCR, it's source, messages, channel, and receiver. Okay? And it takes from different models of the different communication theorists from before. May makita kayong influence ni Laswell, may makita tayong influence ng model ni Shannon and ni Weaver, And then meron ding influence ni Gerbner. As you can see from the model, it starts with a source who then encodes their messages to have a finished product, which goes through a channel and is being decoded by a receiver. Now, the source and the receiver, if you take note, has different capabilities of understanding through their communication skills. Gaano ba sila kagaling mag-communicate? Yung attitudes nila or personal biases nila, knowledge nila of the subject matter, societal systems and culture. Those all affect how a person encodes messages or decodes messages. Now, the messages themselves, they have content. Ano yung mismong message? Ano yung laman niya? They have elements. Paano ba siya nakastructure? Or paano ba siya isinulat? Is it in binary form? Is it in written form, oral form, etc., etc.? How is it being perceived by the receiver? Does the receiver use their sense of hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, or touching to decode that message? Okay? Tapos, ang criticism dito sa model na to is, again, kung mapapansin nyo, it's a linear model, so it has a lack of feedback. Walang mention ng noise or barriers. It assumes that the messages themselves are being transferred objectively. So yan yung lahat ng communication models na ita-take up natin. It's important to understand how these communication models are being used and what they emphasize or what they highlight. So they highlight a particular point or a particular aspect in communication, whether they be the perception of a person from the environment, the ability to send a message, the occurring or reoccurring role of feedback, the challenges of noise, etc., etc. Not one model is perfect or comprehensive. So, walang isang model ang makakapag encapsulate ng lahat ng points na ito. So, we have to pick and choose which models to evaluate media or communication. So, I think it's important to reflect on, sa dami ng communication models sa tinake up natin, aling model yung pinaka nag-resonate sa inyo, pinaka nag-agree kayo, ano yung pinaka applicable sa inyo. So let's move on to the 10 levels of intimacy in today's communication. And gusto ko lang i-note na this is just for the times now. Posibleng madagdagan siya, posibleng mabawasan, depending on the technology that we develop. Okay, so they're arranged by most intimate to least intimate. So we can see na as you go down the list from talking face-to-face, talking in person, to video chat, to calling up someone on the phone, writing a letter or snail mail, instant messaging, text messaging, email, FB messaging, FB status, and then Twitter. We can see that nawawalan ng aspect ng communication which would make something more intimate sana. So the physical presence, first and foremost, because you can react in real time and they can react in real time and you can use their body language to acquire more information. Kaya most intimate yon. Video chat, posibleng magkaroon ng technical problems. Hindi mo kita yung buong katawan ng tao. Right? Posibleng na-alter yung voice because of the microphone, or yung screen, nabublur yung background, so you do not get the actual information which you would if you were talking to that person physically. And then we have calling someone on the phone, of course, walang visual yon. It's just auditory lahat. Snail mail or the handwritten letter would take away the tone of of how a person says something. It also gives a person more time to think carefully of what they're going to say. Next would be instant messaging. The next few ones, syempre, wala masyadong intimacy yun because they're just plain text. Minsan, maikli lang na text. Although ngayon, medyo mas nagiging intimate ngayon yung mga instant messaging or PMs because you can include GIFs, emojis, diba? Smileys, which can help convey your message better. Hindi na siya plain text which can be misunderstood. And then, yung mga FB status or Twitter, sometimes they're the least intimate because they're not actually directed to a particular person minsan. It's more of parang a shoutout. Minsan, it doesn't even garner a response. Posibleng nagsasabi lang siya ng something, popost lang siya ng something. So, ayun. Of course, this list is still a bit subjective, meaning it depends on each person which form is most intimate to them. But generally speaking, it's because of these characteristics kung bakit naka-arrange sila in this manner. Next, we're going to talk about media literacy, information literacy, and digital or technology literacy. We define media literacy as the ability to read, analyze, evaluate, and produce communication in a variety of media forms. Meaning, ito yung kakayanan or skill to take in media content in whatever form, which we'll be learning about in a few weeks, and be able to understand the messages behind it. It also allows us to communicate effectively ourselves using the various media channels. So, hindi lang para maintindihan natin bilang recipients or consumers of media, but also be able to produce or create media content to communicate to others. Next, we have information literacy, which we define as the ability to recognize when information is needed and to locate, evaluate, effectively use, and communicate information in its various formats. Again, kakayanan ito bilang isang tao para una sa lahat, maging maalam kung paano makakuha ng impormasyon na kailangan natin sa kung ano-anong mga pangangailangan. Hindi lang yon, kailangan din maging mapanuri sa klase ng impormasyon, sa pinanggalingan or source, at syempre kung reliable o mapagkakatiwalaan ang klase ng impormasyon na ito. And just like media literacy, tinuturuan tayo na hindi lang umintindi ng impormasyon bilang recipient at maging mapanuri, pero magkakaroon tayo ng kakayanan para gumawa at gumamit ng impormasyon sa tama at epektibong paraan. Lastly, we have technology or digital literacy, which is the ability to use digital technology, communication tools, or networks to locate, evaluate, use, and create information. Higit na nakatutok ito sa wastong paggamit ng mga kagamitang digital para makapag-communicate or gumawa ng impormasyon. Kasi maaring media literate at information literate ang isang tao at naiintindihan niya at alam niya kung anong gusto niya sabihin, ngunit hindi niya magagamit ang mga digital platforms para ipaabot ang kanyang mensahe. Dito papasok yung digital literacy. So kita naman natin na may mga pagkakapareho ang tatlo, ngunit mahalaga na malaman natin ang mga sakop nila bilang mga field of study. Media literacy pertains to the channels or ways in which we communicate and the processes of creating content or messages. Mayroong mga paraan o types of media na digital in nature at dito natin makikita na medyo nagmamerge siya with digital literacy. Sa kabilang banda, mayroong mga skills, may mga skills tayong ginagamit sa pagsusuri or critical thinking na ginagamit natin sa media literacy and sa information literacy. In dealing with information naman, ang mga search skills na dapat malaman na under ng information literacy ay magiging sakop din ng digital literacy kung ang pag-uusapan ay impormasyon na hango sa internet halimbawa. Iilan lang ito sa mga similarities nila. Sa mga susunod na mga linggo, makikita natin kung gaano talaga nila sinasakop ang isa't isa. Ang tatlong ito ay nagkakapareho in a way that they are all competencies or skills. Kaya dinedefine natin sila as a set of competencies that empowers people to access, retrieve, understand, and evaluate. So, ito, nakagrupo ito as consumers, di ba? And use, create, as well as share information and media content. Ito naman, as producers naman ito. In all formats, using various tools in a critical, ethical, and effective way in order to participate and engage in personal, professional, and societal activities, which is simply to communicate or communication. So, huli nating pag-uusapan ay kung paano naapektuhan ng media at information ang communication o pag-communicate. Tingnan muna natin sa media. Sa media, gumagamit tayo ng iba't ibang mga communication tools. May internet, radio, magazines, TV, may newspapers, etc. etc. At gamit ang mga channel na ito, naapektuhan ng media ang effectiveness ng communication, ang reach ng communication, at efficiency ng communication. Pag sinabing effectiveness, mas tatagos ba ang message mo sa taong sinasendan mo ng message kung ang media form na ginagamit mo ay image lang? Paano kung video? Mas mako-convince ba nun yung mga consumers ng media? So, yun ang ibig natin sabihin sa effectiveness. Sa reach naman, dahil meron tayong mga mass communication like internet, TV, radio, newspapers, umaabot ang balita or kung anumang mga articles, messages, advertisements sa mga tao na wala dating access sa ganong klaseng media content. So kung dati ang reach lang ng isang form ng media ay sa urban areas, sa mga lungsod, maaaring umabot na siya at iparating sa mga tao sa rural areas or sa mga probinsya. Mas lumalawak ang reach ngayon ng pag-communicate mo ng message. Lastly, magiging efficient din ang communication. Nababawasan niya ang trabaho na kailangang gawin para iparating yung same message mo dahil sa media. Halimbawa, sa online classes natin, imbes na gawin ko tong lecture na ito ng 6 na beses sa 6 na klase, pwede na akong gumawa ng video at i-upload para i-consume ng lahat ng klase ng sabay-sabay. Mas efficient ngayon itong media form na ito. Kung titingnan naman natin sa information, naapektuhan niya ang communication dahil sa accuracy, dahil sa context, at dahil sa reliability. So because of information, because of data and knowledge of specific events, mas magiging accurate yung sinasabi mo. Tama. Pwede siyang ma-verify. May video na lalabas, may kita yung totoo, mas maraming pwedeng pagtanungan. So, mas madaling ispread ang information. Mas magiging effective din ang communication. Next is context. Mas magiging bukas sa mga tao sa mga iba't ibang points of view at pananaw dahil mas exposed sila sa iba't ibang klase ng impormasyon na meron sa iba't ibang media channels. And lastly, of course, reliability. Mapagkakatiwalaan ba yung source ng information? Mas maniniwala ba tayo sa nakasulat sa halimbawa sa tabloid or sa chismis or kino-communicate orally ng ibang tao na sabi-sabi lang or yung na-verify natin na information with other sources. Ilan lang yon sa mga paraan kung paano naapektuhan ng media at information ang communication. Sa susunod na session, una nating tatalakayin ang mga characteristics at ang importance ng pagiging media literate and information literate na tao. Pagkatapos nun, dadaanan natin ang fundamental elements of media literacy at pagtutuunan natin ng pansin ang isang napaka-importanting skill which is critical thinking. Next ay ang key concepts in media analysis at magtatapos tayo sa questions to ask when analyzing media. So, ano ba yung mga tanong na madalas nating gamitin para suriin ang isang picture, isang advertisement, isang text, any form of media or media content in general.